Hey, welcome back to Trek on the Tube, and welcome back to yet another episode of Star Trek Species. Strap up, brace for impact, because today we're talking about the Ferengi, and there's a lot to cover. Quick reminder, these videos are not intended for Star Trek experts, though if you are one, you are still allowed to watch. These videos are in fact primarily aimed at new fans looking to learn a little something about certain aspects of the franchise without getting spoiled too much. That's why I do leave some details and some things out of the videos. I thank you for understanding. Message is over. Without any further ado, let's get into this Star Trek species, the Ferengi, and let's all follow the 7th rule of acquisition and keep our ears open. Unlike many other very well-known Star Trek species, the Ferengi were not first introduced in the original series. They came in later than that with The Next Generation. But originally intended to be the main villains of that show, the replacement antagonists, if you will, to the Klingons or Romulans, things didn't really work out too well for them. And so they ended up being kinda sidelined. And it was only with the arrival of Deep Space Nine that the Ferengi truly got some screen time and quite a lot of cultural updating and expansion. To tell you the truth, actually, most of what we know about the Ferengi, and thus most of what we're going to talk about today, was established during Deep Space Nine. Even if some ideas and some concepts were kind of being explored in those first episodes of The Next Generation. Okay, so let's first talk about what they look like and where they're from. The Ferengi homeworld is called Ferenginar. It's a cold and damp place, mostly covered in swamps and victim to near constant rainfall. The Ferengi themselves, like most Star Trek species, are humanoid but generally speaking shorter than humans or other fellow Alpha and Beta Quadrant inhabitants. Their skin tones vary from an orangey hue to brownish. They have long blue fingernails and toenails, as well as sharp teeth that seemingly grow continuously because we've seen many Ferengi sharpen their teeth as part of their grooming routine. It would seem Ferengi have no facial hair like beards or mustaches, and they also don't have hair on the top of their heads, but of course, their most defining and noticeable features are their enlarged earlobes and ears, matched with an elongated skull and ridged nose. Thing is, these aren't just aesthetically distinctive, in the sense that the lobes, the ears, actually play a major part in Ferengi culture and society, but we'll get into that in a minute. On the inside, Ferengi have ascending ribs, 2 pairs of lungs, as well as a very unique lobed brain that makes them immune to telepathic and empathic species. To carry on with a few more details about their physiology and biology, they have high blood pressure, compared to humans that is. They live for at least 100 years, which isn't too much technically in Star Trek terms, and have a rather strong immune system when compared to other humanoid species in the galaxy, even if their large ears are prone to infections. About those ears, by the way, it would seem that male earlobes are generally larger than females, but more importantly, they allow Ferengi to benefit from an acute sense of hearing. Also, it must be said that those very same earlobes are very sensitive, be it to pain or pleasure. They even set to tingle when a Ferengi is aroused or senses a profitable business opportunity. Yes, that's right, they tingle for profit. The idea of making a buck actually creates a physical response in their body. It's insane. Anyway, they eat mostly bugs, or maybe that's too general a description, but what we're talking about here is insects, invertebrates, beetles, slugs, and even some fish, apparently, but all of this only from their own planet, as it would seem most Ferengi are disgusted by foods from other worlds. Some also like to inhale a powder called beetle snuff, which is a form of dehydrated beetle with mild euphoric properties. Continuing on with their technology and language, here are some of the ships we've seen them use over the years. There's a certain common design philosophy to them, as you'll notice, that is also somewhat shared by their hand phases. Now, without getting too deep in Ferengi history, I did want to take a second to point out it's pretty unclear as to when the Ferengi became warp capable. We're thinking somewhere around the 22nd century, maybe a bit earlier than that. But most importantly, we don't know if they created their own warp technology or if they acquired it, say bought it, from another species. Anyway, moving right along, we don't know too much about the Ferengi spoken language, but the written form is very interesting indeed. As you can see here, every sentence in, I assume, a paragraph branches off in its own direction from a central hexagon, like some sort of flowchart. One can imagine there's a central theme or topic, and then the written conversation encompasses that idea. I find that fun. I find that interesting and very different from the way we communicate. It kind of reminds me of how the aliens communicate in Arrival, even if it's not exactly the same. But enough about their appearance and language. Let us dive deep into the details of their culture and civilization. And yes, there's a lot to learn, so remember, knowledge equals profit, says the 74th rule of acquisition. You see, the Ferengi are actually quite a complex and elaborate species, probably more culturally nuanced than the average viewer would believe, but still morally flawed by our real-world standards, or even the standards of the Federation of the 24th century. No, I won't get into the debate of whether or not one people and culture has the right to judge another's, especially if they're from different worlds. That is a topic for another day. I do think, however, we can all agree that all people should be born equal into a society, and that's sadly not exactly the case with the Ferengis. So, let's start there. There's no other way to put it. In this patriarchal and misogynistic society, female Ferengi are very much the victims of systemic discrimination. They're not allowed to travel. They're not expected to think. They must be naked at all times. They sign over all of their rights and possessions, if ever they had any, when they get married. And most importantly, female Ferengi are not allowed to earn profit. It sounds like complete hell, to be honest, but why is it so important that they can't earn profit? Well, because Ferengi culture is entirely based around and upon the idea and concept of making profit and the accumulation of wealth. It's all about business. Well, for males, that is. They indeed worship and live by the 5 stages of acquisition: infatuation, justification, appropriation, obsession, and resale. You see, Ferengi, as we knew them not too long ago, were generally speaking all driven by profit, by the accumulation of wealth. That's what their whole life was about. And it was that way because their entire culture revolves around this very concept. It is said that thousands and thousands of years ago, the Ferengi were generous people, not known to be greedy, jealous, or as adversarial and as exploitative as they are now. But even back then, money and possessions were pillars in their society. I mean, in 2700 BC human calendar, they had already created a unified economy for their homeworld. And it was over 10,000 years ago that the first Grand Nagus came to be. This was the first leader of a unified Ferengi people. And with his arrival was created the Ferengi Alliance, the governing body still active to this day. And following that came the changes that would solidify the concepts of profit and wealth into texts of law. Yes, that's right, law. Things like the Bill of Opportunities and the Rules of Acquisition, you know, the things that I started quoting when this video began. And then as time passed, authoritative organizations such as the Ferengi Commerce Authority or the Ferengi Gaming Commission, the Health Commission, the Trade Commission, all were created to enforce the laws and rules of acquisition and profit.
Brat! FCA.
So yes, making a buck is very important to them, so much so it's taught to their young, the lobelings, from a very, very young age. And even a lot of the education of Ferenginar is based around apprenticeships and learning about commerce as soon as possible. Which brings us to the very interesting fact that over time, profit has become kind of more than an ideology, more than a rule. It's actually kind of become a philosophy of life for the Ferengi, a faith almost. Among some of the traditions that they follow, the first is the naming day, in which a Ferengi is officially presented to the members of their family and receives gifts from them. Please note, this is the only time gifts will ever be given to someone with no other engagement of any kind, no need to pay them back. Nothing is expected in return. How generous of them to actually give something to a child, to a baby, to a newborn, and not expect anything in return. Greed is eternal, I guess, as the 10th rule of acquisition goes. Next is the attainment ceremony, where a male Ferengi reaches adulthood and auctions off prized and personal possessions that have some sentimental value in order to raise funds for their, hopefully, lucrative future business endeavors. And then, of course, bringing it right back to where we began, marriage. Marriage itself is nothing more than a contract signed between a prospective groom and the father of the bride. It's a contract between two males, in which the father leases his daughter to the groom for an agreed upon period of time for an agreed upon fee, paid on the birth of a son. Furthermore, pregnancies are considered rentals, the father being the lessee. This is argued by some Ferengi to be a prime example of marital bliss, considering there aren't any divorces or arguments, but still, hot damn. I mean, remember that misogyny we discussed in the beginning, and well, there you go. As if those first examples weren't big enough. And it does get worse before it gets better, sadly, because even if many Ferengi would argue that these philosophies and principles have been beneficial for their people over the centuries, as in the Ferengi have never known slavery or genocides like us humans, they still have the death penalty and ridiculously severe sanctions for ridiculously strict laws. You see, greed, deceit, distrust, and opportunism are not cons but pros for the Ferengi people. But of course, failing to take advantage of an opportunity is a crime. Breaking a contract is a crime. Slavery may not be a thing, but exploitation is common practice. And as we just mentioned, capital punishment still exists, and interestingly enough is even preferred by many over losing their commerce license. Quick side note, when it comes to this capital punishment, this death penalty, it's not a humane thing. They don't humanely take you somewhere and, you know, put you to sleep or have you go out quietly. No, not at all. What they do is they bring you up to the top of the Tower of Commerce, which is a 40-story high building, and they throw you off the top. And then they let you fall down to the goddamn sacred marketplace while innocent bystanders and watchers can place bets on where it is exactly you're going to land. So, yeah, that's what a wonderful people. Just flawless. Point is, now that you understand how important profit and the respect of the rules are to the Ferengi, let us get back to if a female Ferengi were, for example, to make profit, well, she'd have to return it. And if she couldn't, her family members would have to, and she would be sentenced to a set number of years of servitude, dear Lord. Speaking of punishments and death, as part of the elaborate faith and philosophy that has evolved over time in Ferengi culture, they believe that the universe is bound together with something called the Great Material Continuum, and they believe that accumulating material possessions in this life will set them up for the next one in the sense that it will help them navigate the great river of the continuum. You see, as the story goes, upon death, each Ferengi finds themselves evaluated by the blessed exchequer to whom they pray to in life, to see if they've earned enough profit in their life. A successful Ferengi will then bribe their way into the divine treasury, where they could then use the wealth they accumulated in life to bid on the next one under the supervision of the celestial auctioneers. Whereas, however, an unsuccessful Ferengi might be cast into the vault of eternal destitution, never to return, never to be reincarnated, never to be allowed the opportunity to make profit once again. I know, it's a whole thing. It's pretty impressive, actually. It must be said also that the Ferengi do not allow autopsies. The Ferengi customs do not allow autopsies because the Ferengi actually cut up their dead and sell off, parts of them to the highest bidders. Now, most of what we've talked about so far was established in Deep Space Nine, even if their first appearance on screen was in The Next Generation, as we specified earlier. Now, here's the thing. When the Ferengi were first introduced, they were like this, which aesthetically speaking is pretty much the same as what became the most official version of them, if you will. But it was the way they were portrayed that was so very peculiar. You see, these guys were simultaneously supposed to embody some of the more negative aspects of our own real-world society, like greed or jealousy, as we mentioned, but they were also supposed to be a new interesting villainous species for the franchise. Sadly though, a group of hunched over, hissing, squirming, whispering, whimpering, stupid, laser-wielding individuals didn't really deliver on that promise, and so the Ferengi were kinda abandoned for a short while, until brought back, slightly revamped, slightly changed. Expand or die, as goes the 95th rule of acquisition. That's right, as the next generation progressed, the Ferengi came back. Certainly not as often as was originally planned, certainly not as serious villains, but more kind of a joke species, a people always very easily outwitted or known to make predictably bad decisions based on their desire for profit. And although they weren't around all that much, it was enough for us to start learning a bit about them. No, all of those things we just talked about weren't already established yet, but yes, the basic idea of having a species constantly searching for profit was already there. It really is the general stupidity, I suppose, and ridiculousness of their posture that disappeared as they were granted more screen time. And, you know, of course, the laser whips went away. Now, it would seem that as time passed, interacting with Federation species, sharing sectors of space, living on space stations with them, kinda started changing Ferengi culture. Because as last we saw them, reforms were being made, especially in regards to women. Are the Ferengi still attracted to wealth and ready to do almost anything for it? Yes. Rule of Acquisition 34. War is good for business. Rule of Acquisition 35, peace is good for business. So of course, just as it always has, the Ferengi Alliance remains neutral in interstellar affairs. You see, enemies diminish profit. The Alliance is still absolutely willing to put profit before the safety and freedom of the people they encounter in space. But with the rise of a new Nagus, and some interesting research made about the Ferengi population, steps to equality have been made. 53% of the Ferengi population is female, and turns out, in the eyes of many, that's a lot of potential customers, clients, or even business associates. In other words, there's money to be made with this huge portion of the population. Clothes. Also, laws have been passed to allow Ferengi women to wear clothes. The idea behind that being if they wear clothes, they'll have pockets, and if they have pockets, they'll want to fill them with money. Another interesting cultural shift is after the Dominion War, more than 40% of the Ferengi population no longer seem to believe that they have to buy or bribe their way into the divine treasury. I don't exactly know why that is, for example. Maybe it has to do with the enormous death toll that war brought, but yeah, point is, things are changing. Changing for the better. And on that positive note, I think we've pretty much come to the end of it. A few final things I'd like to mention as bullet points would be, in the Mirror Universe, although we haven't seen them too much, it would simply seem that they are less greedy, less driven by profit than in the Prime timeline, but also, sadly, enslaved and often killed by the Klingon-Cardassian alliance. The Ferengi Alliance itself, by the way, in Prime timeline of course, is a very peculiar organization in that it provides ships and titles to successful Ferengi businessmen, but is completely devoid of responsibility when it comes to the actions these daemon and their crew take. So when a Ferengi daemon steals your ship and sells your crew as slaves, you can't really hold the Ferengi Alliance, you know, the governing body, responsible for that. You can't actually complain to them because, well, you know, they're not responsible. Even if the daemon and his crew and his ship are part of the Ferengi Alliance fleet. And then the two final things I wanted to talk about were the Ferengi appearances in both Enterprise and Lower Decks. Officially speaking, first visual contact between humans and Ferengi was in the 24th century, in 2364 to be exact. There is a Deep Space Nine episode that cleverly explains that's not quite true, but I won't spoil it for you. In Enterprise, however, in 2151, we get Ferengi and humans interacting. It's not so much a canon breach as it is more a canon bend. So tell the canon cop to stay where the hell he is. We don't need him here. And I say that because they never technically formally introduced themselves as the Ferengi, but the fun thing is the show took the time to make them a little closer to how they were the very first time we saw them on screen. They were more crouched, they hissed more, they even had those laser whips, and that was fun. In my opinion, it's that kind of attention to detail that enriches the world. You know, it goes a long way in solidifying the diversity and growth of the species. Which brings us to the Ferengi appearance in Lower Decks. The first time our guest character pops up on screen, he is exactly like those first Ferengi. Like the ones, not so much from Enterprise, but really from The Next Generation Season 1. He's speaking broken English, he's hissing, he's squirming, he's completely idiotic. But when he comes back, he's more of a Deep Space Nine style Ferengi, more of a quark. And then you realize he was putting on an act earlier. And that adds so many more layers to who the Ferengi are, how they're perceived, and their own perception of how they're perceived by others. Also, on a very personal note, I think that what Lower Decks did with that Ferengi character is just... it's not far off from a stroke of genius. I think it's very, very clever, and it's a fantastic way of, I suppose, correcting continuity or helping continuity grow into a more coherent thing, all the while making fun of it and having fun with the errors of the past and the errors that Star Trek made at a certain time. Anyway, it's great. That's all there is to it. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've learned at least a little something. Please do hit that like button, share with your friends, leave a comment telling me what species you'd like to hear about next, and do consider subscribing. You can also become a patron and support this channel financially like all of these fine people. Technically, I didn't give any advice, I just explained something, but free advice is seldom cheap, as the 59th rule of acquisition goes. I think that's the most appropriate here, or at least the closest I could find. Thank you so much, everyone. You're the best. Stay safe. The vaccine is coming for all of us, and live long and prosper.